What if the most psychologically complex character on Cartoon Network isn't from a prestige show? What if it's a 12-year-old blue cat who can't pass middle school, whose ego is literally bigger than his house, and who once tried to frame a flower for theft because he was jealous? What if I told you that a psychologist, a real one, not a cartoon one, not Mr. Small burning incense and talking about chakras, a real psychologist could sit down with Gumball Watterson's file and find enough material for a full semester's worth of case studies? I mean, think about that for a second. We're talking about a character from a show where a piece of toast gets murdered and respawns every single day. A show where a banana's mom is a painting. A show where the school nurse is a bandage wrapped around nothing. And yet somehow, buried inside all of that beautiful, chaotic, mixed media madness is one of the most honest psychological portraits of a child you'll find anywhere in animation. Maybe anywhere in fiction, period. And tonight, we're going to pull it apart. All of it. We're going to look at Gumball Watterson the way a psychologist would, through the lens of attachment theory, identity formation, ego defense mechanisms, anxiety disorders, emotional regulation, self-sabotage, family systems theory, and about a dozen other concepts that you probably didn't think applied to a show where a T-Rex goes to junior high. But they do. Oh, they absolutely do. And the fact that they do, the fact that Ben Bocquelet and his writers built something this layered, is exactly why we're going to be here for a while. So if you're watching this late at night, get comfortable. Grab whatever you grab. Blanket, pillow, headphones, the whole thing. Because we're going deep into the mind of a 12-year-old cat. And honestly, it's going to get heavier than you'd expect. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these for you. We're a small channel doing long videos about cartoons that deserve this kind of attention. And every subscription matters. Okay, let's go. I want to start with something specific, a single moment, and then we're going to spiral outward from it until we've touched everything, every corner of who Gumball is, every contradiction, every hidden depth. And then we're going to come back to this moment, and it's going to mean something completely different. The moment is from Season 3, Episode 37, The Downer. If you haven't seen it, here's the setup. Gumball wakes up in a terrible mood. Not a funny bad mood, not a cartoonish grumpy morning, a real one. The kind where you can't name what's wrong. You just know that everything feels gray and heavy and you want the world to stop bothering you. His family tries to cheer him up. They crowd around his bed. They pet him like he's an actual cat. They offer advice. Richard says something that sounds dumb, but is actually pretty profound. You know what I do when I'm feeling down? I pretend to be happy until I find that I am. And Gumball, in a voice that's almost too real for a cartoon, screams at all of them to go away and leave him in peace. And they do. Or at least, he thinks they do. Everyone vanishes. Elmore is empty. The whole world feels abandoned. And here's the thing. The show doesn't play this for laughs. Not at first. The color palette drains. The signs change. Joyful Burger becomes Misery Burger. And then this enormous dark mass starts consuming the world, swallowing buildings, eating the sky. And Gumball says, and I swear, this line delivers differently when you're an adult. The darkness, it's calling me. I feel like I should run, but my legs won't. That's a children's cartoon on Cartoon Network, aired July 2015. And it's depicting what a psychologist would recognize instantly as a dissociative episode filtered through a depressive lens. The world literally changes to match his internal state. His perception warps reality, and the only thing that saves him, the only thing that pulls him out of it, is remembering his family, remembering that he matters to someone. Now, does the show undercut this a little bit at the end? By revealing it was all in his head? Sure. But here's what I think is actually brilliant about that. Because that's exactly what depression does. It convinces you the world is empty. It convinces you that nobody cares. And then when you come out the other side, people tell you it was all in your head, as if that makes it less real. Gumball, whether the writers intended every layer of this or not, captured something true about how emotional disturbances function. The experience was real, even if the empty streets weren't. And for a 12-year-old watching this show, that validation, the idea that sometimes you feel terrible for no reason and that's okay, is genuinely important. And I want to hold that image. Gumball standing alone in an empty world, chased by darkness, because it's going to be the lens through which we examine everything else about him. Because I think that moment, more than any other, shows us the core psychological tension of Gumball Watterson. He is a child who desperately needs connection, but whose every instinct pushes people away. Let me explain what I mean. If you were to sit a psychologist down and show them, say, The first 2 seasons of this show, just the raw episodes, no context. Here's what I think they'd notice first. Not the sarcasm, not the schemes, not the ego. They'd notice the anxiety. Gumball Watterson is one of the most anxious characters in children's animation. And I don't mean anxious in the colloquial sense, not, oh, he worries sometimes. I mean clinically anxious. The character displays consistent patterns of social anxiety, performance anxiety, separation anxiety, and generalized anxiety that manifest in almost every episode. He catastrophizes, he avoids, he overcompensates, he projects. And the show, to its immense credit, treats all of this as simultaneously the source of his comedy and the source of his pain. Look at The Meddler from season 1, first aired in February 2012. Nicole comes to school with Gumball because she feels guilty about not paying him enough attention. And what happens? He melts down. Not because his mom is annoying, well, yes, partly that, but because her presence in his social environment triggers every anxiety response he has. She embarrasses him in front of Penny. She calls him Gummy Puss. She tries to bathe him in the school shower. And Gumball screams, literally screams, "What do I have to do to get noticed in this house?" Which is devastating, right? Because the whole episode started because he wasn't being noticed. And now that he's being noticed, it's the wrong kind of attention, and he can't handle that either. A psychologist would look at this and see a classic approach avoidance conflict. Gumball wants attention, craves it actually, but he wants it on his terms. And the gap between the attention he needs and the attention he can tolerate creates this constant state of frustration. He needs his mother to see him, but he needs her to see him the way he sees himself, which is as competent and cool and worthy of Penny's affection. When Nicole sees him as a baby who needs protecting, it threatens his fragile self-image. And the anxiety comes from the threat, not the attention itself. I've been thinking about this for a while, honestly. I've probably rewatched The Meddler 4 or 5 times putting this together, and what strikes me every time is how physical the anxiety is. The animators give Gumball this hunched, contracted posture when Nicole is around him at school. His 2D body, and remember, he's a flat, hand-drawn character moving through photographed real-world backgrounds. His body actually seems to get smaller, like the anxiety is literally shrinking him. And I don't know if that was a conscious animation choice, but it works. It works so well. Now let's take that thread and pull it outward. One of the most psychologically rich episodes in the entire series. And yeah, I know that's a big claim for a show with over 240 episodes, but I'm standing by it, is Season 3, Episode 7, The Name. First aired in 2014. This is the one where Gumball discovers his real, legal name is Zach. And upon learning this, he doesn't just adopt a new nickname. He develops an entirely separate personality. Okay, let's slow down and actually look at what happens here, because this episode is doing something that I genuinely think is underappreciated. Gumball finds out his birth name is Zach, and immediately he starts acting differently. He gets confident, cocky, he rides a skateboard, he pops his collar, he refers to himself in the third person. And here's the crucial detail. Zach doesn't just act cool, he actively rewrites Gumball's memories, replacing every failure with a victory. That scene from The Curse, where Gumball fell off a bridge, Zach changes it so he made the jump while doing a handstand. Every embarrassing moment gets overwritten, and as Zach rewrites more memories, Gumball starts to fade. Literally, visually, he gets more transparent. The original personality is being erased. Darwin even asks at one point, what does it mean? And the answer the show gives is pretty clear. If Zach replaces all of Gumball's memories, Gumball ceases to exist. Now, I want you to think about what this episode is actually saying about identity and psychology. A psychologist would recognize Zach as a textbook narcissistic defense mechanism. When Gumball encounters an identity that seems better, cooler, more successful, more confident, a part of him tries to adopt it wholesale. But the adoption requires the destruction of his actual self, his real memories, his real failures, his genuine identity, which is messy and embarrassing and full of losses. The show is depicting, with startling accuracy, what happens when someone tries to replace authentic selfhood with a constructed persona. The persona can't coexist with the real person. It has to consume them. And here's what really gets me about this episode. How does Gumball win? How does he defeat Zach? Not through strength, not through some clever scheme. He wins because he finds a memory that's already a victory. The arcade game at the beginning of the episode, where he succeeded through button mashing, a completely unglamorous, unimpressive, real win. Gumball types his real name into the machine, and Zack disintegrates. The psychological implication is extraordinary for a children's show. The way you defeat a false self isn't by fighting it. It's by anchoring to something real, something authentic, even if that authentic thing is small and kind of pathetic by conventional standards. Button mashing isn't cool, it isn't impressive, but it's real. It's Gumball's, and that's what saves him. I actually have a theory about the name that I've never seen anyone else bring up. I think the episode functions as a meta-commentary on Gumball's character development across the series. In Season 1, he was this cheerful, almost cloyingly sweet kid. And then, the show consciously made him more sarcastic, more cynical, more of a quote-unquote cool character, which is basically what happened when the writers themselves chose to give him a Zack personality. The episode is the show acknowledging that the edgier version of the character threatens to erase what made the original version work. And the solution, finding authenticity, is the show committing to the idea that Gumball can be sarcastic and vulnerable, cool and a loser, without one erasing the other. That's not just good writing, that's psychological wisdom. Genuine integration of the self requires accepting all parts, the failures alongside the wins. And look, I know I keep circling back to this idea of Gumball's ego versus his authentic self, but that's because the show keeps circling back to it too. It's the spiral at the center of everything. In The One, Season 5, the show literally visualizes Gumball's ego as a creature bigger than his house. Like, physically, his ego takes up more space than the building where his family lives. And Darwin has to show him this, has to physically walk him to the representation of his ego and go, look at this. And Gumball's reaction isn't to be horrified. It's more like resigned, like he already knew. And this is where things get really interesting from a psychological perspective, because Gumball's massive ego isn't confidence. A psychologist would distinguish between healthy self-esteem and narcissistic inflation. Healthy self-esteem comes from a stable internal sense of worth. Narcissistic inflation comes from needing external validation so desperately that you construct a grandiose self-image to cover the emptiness underneath. And Gumball is textbook inflation. Think about The Others, Season 4. This is the episode where Gumball discovers that there are other students at Elmore Junior High. Students he's never noticed. Students who have been there the whole time. And why hasn't he noticed them? Because, as the show explicitly states, Gumball believed the world revolved around him. His ego was so inflated that it literally blocked out the existence of other people. And when he tries to insert himself into Claire Cooper's life, when he tries to become the hero of her story, he doesn't do it out of pure selfishness. He does it because he can't conceive of a narrative where he isn't central. His psychological framework requires him to be the protagonist at all times. When he encounters a story that doesn't include him, his instinct isn't to observe or support, it's to colonize. He invades Claire's life, ignores her wishes, and tries to force a happy ending that conforms to his understanding of how stories work. And honestly, this is one of the most incisive critiques of the protagonist syndrome that I've ever seen in any medium. The idea that some people experience reality as a story in which they're the main character, and they genuinely cannot process situations where they're not. A psychologist would call this a form of egocentrism, not in the moral sense, but in the cognitive sense. Gumball's ability to take other perspectives is genuinely limited. But, and I need you to hear this part, it's not that he doesn't care about other people. He does. He cares desperately. Look at how he treats Darwin. Look at what he does in The Shell. Look at The Rerun, where Rob temporarily kills Darwin and Gumball goes into an absolute fury trying to save him. The care is real. The love is real. But it's filtered through an ego structure that makes genuine empathy incredibly difficult. And I think that's the show's most psychologically honest insight about children. Kids aren't sociopaths. They're not unfeeling. But their empathy exists inside a cognitive framework that's still developing. They can feel intense love and simultaneously believe the world revolves around them. They can be devastated by someone's pain and still make it about themselves. That's not hypocrisy, that's development. Let me pull the spiral wider. I want to talk about Gumball's relationship with his family, because if you're doing a psychological profile, you can't understand the individual without understanding the system. Family systems theory, and this is a real branch of psychology, developed by Murray Bowen in the 1960s, argues that families function as emotional units. The behavior of any one member can only be understood in the context of the whole system. And the Watterson family system is, well, it's a case study in dysfunction that somehow produces functional outcomes. Let me break it down. Nicole Watterson is the overperforming, hyper-competent, emotionally volatile cornerstone of the family. She works at the Rainbow Factory. She's the sole breadwinner. She keeps the house from literally falling apart. And she does all of this while managing what is clearly, and the show doesn't shy away from this, a significant anger management problem. In The Limit, Season 2, she transforms into a literal monster when pushed past her breaking point. Yellow eyes, sharp teeth. The whole supermarket gets destroyed, and the show frames this as simultaneously terrifying and sympathetic, because everyone can see how unfair her load is. And I want to spend a moment on Nicole's anger, because it's one of the most psychologically nuanced things in the show, and it directly shapes who Gumball is. Nicole's anger isn't random. It isn't a character quirk. It's a pressure valve. She carries the weight of an entire family, 3 children, one of whom is effectively a 4th child in the form of her husband. She works long hours at a factory. She comes home to chaos every single day. She cooks, she cleans, she disciplines, she protects. And she does all of this without recognition, without rest, and without support. The show was created by Bocquelet, based on his own mother, and he's described her as kick-ass. But behind that description is a woman who was doing the work of 3 people because nobody else would. Nicole's anger is what happens when a competent person is placed in an impossible situation and expected to smile about it. It's burnout expressed as rage, and the show doesn't pathologize it. It contextualizes it. In The Limit, when Nicole finally snaps, the episode doesn't end with her being punished for her anger. It ends with the family apologizing to her because they pushed her to breaking point, because they took and took and took without giving back. And the anger, while scary, was earned. But here's what makes this psychologically significant for Gumball. He grows up in a household where the most powerful person, the person he looks up to most, is also the most volatile. Nicole's love is fierce, but so is her rage. And for a child, that creates a very specific internal equation. Love equals intensity. Connection equals volatility. The people who care about you the most are the ones who can hurt you the most. And you learn to navigate love the way you'd navigate a minefield, carefully, anxiously, with constant vigilance for signs of explosion. This is what attachment theorists call an ambivalent attachment pattern. The child never knows which version of the parent they're going to get. Sometimes they get the warm, protective Nicole, who calls Gumball Gummy Puss, and fights a T-Rex to keep him safe. Sometimes they get the raging Nicole, who destroys a supermarket and chases the family through the aisles. And because the child can't predict which Nicole is coming, they develop a constant state of alertness. They become, in a word, anxious. Does that sound like anyone we've been discussing for the past several hours? Nicole's love is real. Her competence is extraordinary. Her sacrifices are heroic. And she is also, inadvertently, the primary source of Gumball's anxiety. She's his hero and his trigger, his protector and his pressure. And the show holds both of these truths simultaneously, without flinching from either. I actually think Nicole's psychology could be its own video, honestly. There's so much there. The way her competitive drive with Yuki Yoshida in the Fury maps onto her childhood training. The way she weaponized her parents' perfectionism into martial arts skill. The way she chose Richard specifically, because he would never pressure her to be perfect, and then spends the rest of her life frustrated that he won't try to be anything at all. The way she delivers the first line in the entire show, in the DVD, because she's the one who starts everything, the engine that drives the family machine. There's a whole video in just Nicole Watterson's psychology. But tonight is about Gumball, so I'll save that for another time. What I will say is this. Nicole's characterization is based on Bocquelet's own mother. He named her after her, and there's a line in The Choices, in the transcript you can read it, where Nicole looks at her chaotic, food-covered, screaming family and decides she wouldn't change any of it. Not the poverty, not the mess, not the husband who can't cook, not the son who can't pass middle school. She freezes time, reviews her entire life, and chooses this. And then she starts a food fight. I don't know what Bocquelet's mother thought when she watched that episode, but I hope she felt seen, in The Choices, Season 5. And this is the episode with the 9.8 rating on IMDb, one of the highest rated episodes of any cartoon on that platform. We get Nicole's full backstory. We learn that she was raised by perfectionist parents who chewed her out for having an F on her report card, in the field indicating her gender. Being a girl was not an excuse. Her mother, Mary Senecourt, had expectations so impossibly high that Nicole could never meet them. Her father had a temper. The combination, perfectionism plus anger, got passed directly down to Nicole. She is her parents, despite being nothing like her parents. And this is crucial for understanding Gumball, because in family systems theory, patterns of behavior don't just stay in one generation. They cascade, they transform, and sometimes they invert. Nicole's parents demanded perfection. Nicole, in response, married the least perfect man she could find, Richard Watterson, a man whose defining characteristic is his complete inability to function as an adult. And together, they created a family where the standards are simultaneously impossibly high and completely absent. I mean, think about what that does to a kid like Gumball. His mother can literally outrun the speed of sound and defeat a T-Rex in single combat. She can generate energy blasts through sheer maternal determination, as shown in The Fury, Season 5. She is, by any measure, extraordinary. And his father once put cement instead of flour in cupcakes. His father believed his own dad when he said he was going out to buy milk and would be right back, and he was gone for years. His father's sheltered upbringing under Granny JoJo's suffocating protectiveness created a man who, as Richard himself admits in The Lady, feels like he's not very good at being a man. So Gumball grows up with two models. One model says, "The world is a battle, and you must be strong enough to win it." The other model says, "The world is a playground, and if you just lie down, someone else will handle it." And Gumball tries to do both at once. He inherits his mother's temper. We see it. There's that incredible moment in The Name, or elsewhere, where Darwin says, "You sound like Mrs. Mom." And Gumball responds in Nicole's exact voice. And he inherits his father's laziness. He has Nicole's need to control and Richard's inability to follow through. He is, psychologically, the synthesis of two people who should not have been combined. And you know what? That's most kids. Most of us are walking contradictions of our parents' opposing traits. The show just makes it visible. There's this term in psychology, parentification, that describes what happens when a child is forced to take on the emotional or practical responsibilities of a parent. And while Gumball isn't a textbook case, there are elements of it throughout the series. Because Richard doesn't function as a competent parent most of the time, Gumball is sometimes forced into the role of the household's secondary adult. He has to manage his father. He has to navigate situations that a 12-year-old shouldn't have to navigate. And when he fails at this, which he does, constantly, the show presents it as comedy. But the underlying dynamic is a child being asked to carry weight that isn't his. And you know what happens when you put too much weight on someone who isn't ready for it? They develop coping mechanisms. Let me talk about Gumball's coping mechanisms, because they're fascinating, and they're everywhere. First, humor. Gumball's sarcasm is his primary defense. When he's uncomfortable, he deflects. When he's scared, he cracks jokes. When he's hurt, he makes sure you know he doesn't care, which is itself a way of showing how much he cares. This is textbook reaction formation, a Freudian defense mechanism where you express the opposite of what you actually feel. Gumball isn't naturally sarcastic. Season 1, Gumball barely has any sarcasm at all. He's open, genuine, almost naively sweet. The sarcasm develops as a response to repeated humiliation and disappointment. It's armor. And it's armor that the show acknowledges as armor, because every so often, the mask slips, and we see the kid underneath. Second, denial. Gumball's relationship with Mr. Robinson is the most sustained example of denial in the entire show. For years, literally years of episodes, Gumball and Darwin worship this miserable old man who openly despises them. Mr. Robinson hates the Watterson family with a burning passion, and Gumball cannot or will not see it. He reinterprets every cruel word as playful banter, every slammed door as a funny quirk. And it isn't until The Heart, very late in the series, that Gumball finally, painfully, accepts the truth. Mr. Robinson doesn't like him, never did. Why does this matter psychologically? Because it tells us something about Gumball's attachment style. He attaches to people who reject him. He invests in relationships that don't reciprocate. And when evidence mounts that the relationship is one-sided, He ignores the evidence rather than face the rejection. This is an anxious, preoccupied attachment pattern. Someone who desires closeness so strongly that they'll deny reality to maintain even the illusion of connection. And the Mr. Robinson thing goes even deeper than that, if you let yourself sit with it for a minute. Because Mr. Robinson isn't just any neighbor. He's an older man who represents a kind of respectability and adulthood that Gumball admires. Robinson has a nice house. He has routines. He has a wife. He is, in Gumball's unconscious framework, what a successful grown-up looks like. And Gumball doesn't just want Robinson's attention. He wants Robinson's approval. He wants a father figure who has his life together, because the father figure he actually has doesn't. I'm not saying Richard doesn't matter. He matters enormously. But Richard represents one version of adulthood, the version where you never grow up, where you stay playful and present and useless. Mr. Robinson represents another version, the version where you're competent and respectable but miserable. And Gumball, whether he knows it or not, is looking at these two models and trying to figure out if there's a third option, something in between, something that's neither Peter Pan nor the grumpy old man next door. And the show never gives him that third option, not explicitly, because the show understands that 12-year-olds don't find the answer. They find the question. And the question, who am I going to be when I grow up, is itself the most psychologically important question a child can ask. Third coping mechanism, projection. This one's subtle, but it shows up everywhere once you start looking. Gumball consistently attributes his own worst qualities to other people. In The Flower, his jealousy is literally externalized as a separate entity. In The Name, his narcissism becomes a separate personality. In The Downer, his depression reshapes the entire world around him. The show takes internal psychological states and projects them outward, onto the environment, onto other characters, onto the fabric of reality itself. And that's not just a storytelling choice. That's how projection works in real psychology. You take the thing you can't accept about yourself, the anger, the fear, the shame, and you put it somewhere else. You see your own rage in other people's faces. You hear your own insecurities in other people's words. The world becomes a mirror that reflects your worst qualities back at you. And because they're out there instead of in here, you can fight them without fighting yourself. Gumball's entire world is a projection. Elmore is Gumball's psyche, externalized and animated in 12 different styles. And every adventure, every scheme, every chase, every cosmic catastrophe is a child processing his internal landscape through the only medium available to him, action. He can't sit in a therapist's office and talk about his feelings. He's 12. He doesn't have the vocabulary. So instead, he turns his feelings into stories, into adventures, into enemies he can punch, and problems he can scheme his way out of. And the fact that the adventures never fully resolve, that the lessons don't stick, that the status quo resets, that tomorrow will bring a new version of the same problem, isn't a failure. It's the most honest depiction of emotional processing that children's television has ever attempted, because that's how kids process emotions. Not through insight, not through reflection, through play, through action, through stories where they're the hero and the villain and the victim and the savior all at once. Through trying the same thing over and over in slightly different configurations until something clicks or doesn't, and they try again. I want to talk about one more aspect of Gumball's social psychology that I think deserves attention, and it's his relationship with the broader social ecosystem of Elmore Junior High. Because Gumball's position in the school's social hierarchy tells us a lot about how he navigates group dynamics. Gumball is not popular. He's not unpopular either. He exists in a strange middle zone where everyone knows who he is. He's hard to miss, given the amount of chaos he generates. But nobody particularly wants to be associated with him. He has acquaintances, but few real friends beyond Darwin. He has a girlfriend, Penny, but their relationship exists in a semi-separate bubble from the rest of the social ecosystem. He interacts with virtually everyone at the school, but the interactions are transactional rather than deep. In social psychology, there's a distinction between sociometric popularity, how well-liked a person actually is, and perceived popularity, how visible and influential they are. Gumball has high perceived popularity, everyone knows him, and moderate to low sociometric popularity. Not many people genuinely like him, and research shows that this combination, visible but not well liked, is one of the most psychologically stressful positions a child can occupy, because you get all the scrutiny of being noticed with none of the protection of being valued. And Gumball's response to this position is, predictably, to double down on visibility. If people are going to notice you anyway, make sure they notice you on your terms. Control the narrative. Be the funny one. Be the one who did the thing. Because if you're going to be talked about regardless, it's better to be talked about for something you chose than for something that happened to you. This is impression management in its rawest form, and it's exhausting. The constant performance, the always-on quality of Gumball's personality. He's never just existing. He's always performing, always managing how he's perceived, always curating his image. Even though the image he's curating, the sarcastic underachiever who doesn't care about anything, is itself a defense against caring too much. I see this in real kids all the time, by the way, not just in cartoons. That kid in every classroom who's always on, always performing, always making sure they're the center of attention. And you look at that kid and you think, they're so confident, they're so comfortable with themselves. But underneath, almost without exception, there's an ocean of anxiety. Because the performance is the anxiety. The performance is what the anxiety looks like from the outside. And the fact that this show, a show about a blue cat on Cartoon Network, captures that dynamic so precisely is honestly kind of remarkable. Let me also say something about how the show handles bullying, because it's relevant to Gumball's psychology, and it's something the show does differently from almost every other children's program. In The Fight, Season 1, Tina Rex, a literal Tyrannosaurus, is established as the school bully. She's huge. She's terrifying. She chases Gumball and makes his life miserable. And Nicole, being Nicole, challenges Tina's father to a fight and wins by destroying their house. Standard cartoon stuff. But then the show does something unexpected. At the end of the episode, Tina admits that she wasn't trying to bully Gumball. She thought they were playing. She was having fun. From her perspective, the relationship was reciprocal. She didn't know Gumball was scared because nobody told her. And when Gumball and Tina actually talk, without Nicole's intervention, they become friends. They hug. The bully wasn't a bully. She was a lonely dinosaur who didn't know how to make friends. And I need you to think about what that says psychologically, because most children's shows present bullying as a clear moral binary. There are bullies and there are victims, and the solution is either standing up to the bully or getting adult help. And those shows aren't wrong exactly, but they're incomplete because real-world bullying is often more complicated than that. Sometimes the bully doesn't know they're bullying. Sometimes the power dynamic is invisible to the person with the power. Sometimes the solution isn't confrontation or authority, it's communication. And Gumball, a kid who struggles with communication, who uses sarcasm as a shield, who'd rather scheme than talk, discovers in this episode that his biggest fear, Tina, was based on a misunderstanding. That the monster wasn't actually monstrous. That he'd been projecting threat onto something that was actually just different. Does that remind you of anything? It should, because it's exactly what happens with Penny's shell. The thing that looks scary turns out to be beautiful. The thing that looks like a threat turns out to be a friend. Over and over, this show tells Gumball, and by extension the viewer, that the world is less hostile than you think. That your fear is real, but what you're afraid of usually isn't. And that's not just comforting, that's therapeutic. And where did he learn this? Where does any kid learn their attachment style? From their primary attachment figure, from Nicole. Now, I want to be clear, Nicole is not a bad mother. The show goes out of its way to demonstrate that she loves her children fiercely and would literally destroy anyone who threatened them. But her love comes with conditions that Gumball can never quite meet. She wants him to be better than he is. She wants him to succeed. And when he doesn't succeed, which is most of the time, because he's 12 and kind of a disaster, there's this flicker of disappointment that the show captures perfectly in 1,000 tiny moments. A sigh, a look, a tone of voice. Nicole never says, "You're not good enough." She doesn't have to. Gumball can feel it. And here's where the spiral brings us back. Remember the downer? Gumball standing alone in an empty world, consumed by darkness. I think that episode is showing us what Gumball's internal world looks like when all the defense mechanisms fail, when the sarcasm stops working, when the denial breaks, when the ego deflates. What's underneath is a child who is terrified of being alone, terrified of being insufficient, and convinced on some level that the darkness is what he deserves. I need to talk about The Shell now, because it's maybe the most important episode for understanding Gumball's psychological landscape. And it's definitely the episode that proved this show could do things that most adult dramas can't pull off. Season 3, Episode 20, first aired in 2014. This is the one where Gumball accidentally cracks Penny Fitzgerald's shell during a school play, revealing that she's not an antlered peanut at all. She's a shape-shifting fairy whose form changes based on her emotions. When she's happy, she's luminous, glowing, beautiful. When she feels ugly or rejected, she transforms into monsters. A dragon, a wolf, a gorgon, creatures with horns and teeth and rage. And the entire episode becomes about whether Gumball can love Penny, really love her, when she's not wrapped in the protective shell of who he thought she was. Ben Bacalé described this episode as Miyazaki-esque, and he wasn't wrong. The chase through Elmore, as Gumball pursues a terrified, transforming Penny, has direct visual references to Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away. Penny's dragon form looks like Haku. Her wolf form is a nod to Moro. These aren't accidents. They're conscious choices by animators who understood they were telling a story about seeing someone's true self and choosing to stay. But from a psychological perspective, here's what's really happening. Penny's shell is a literal manifestation of a psychological concept called the false self, the persona we construct to be socially acceptable. When the shell cracks, what emerges isn't ugly, it's actually beautiful. But Penny doesn't know that, because she's spent her whole life being told the shell is who she's supposed to be. Her father, Patrick, is terrified of her being without it. The shell is safety. The shell is tradition. The shell is what protects you from the world seeing what you really are. And Gumball, impulsive, anxious, ego-driven Gumball, does the single most psychologically healthy thing he does in the entire series. He chases her, not to put the shell back on, not to fix her, but to tell her that he loves what's underneath, that her looks don't define who she is, just how she feels. And when he kisses her in her wolf form, when he chooses the version of her that is monstrous and angry and frightened, she transforms back into her true, glowing self. I'm going to say something that might sound like an overstatement, but I believe it completely. That scene, Gumball kissing Monster Penny in a dark forest while the music swells, is one of the most psychologically profound moments in children's television. Because it's teaching kids something that most adults haven't learned. That love isn't about the shell someone wears. It's about what happens when the shell comes off. And the transformation back to beauty doesn't happen because Penny changed. It happens because someone saw her worst self and didn't leave. A psychologist would call this unconditional positive regard, a concept from Carl Rogers' humanistic psychology. Rogers argued that personal growth requires an environment where someone feels accepted regardless of their condition or behavior. And that's exactly what Gumball provides in that moment. He offers acceptance without condition, and Penny blossoms. And it goes further than that, right? Because the shell doesn't just end with the kiss. It fundamentally changes the show. Penny stays out of her shell. She never goes back. This isn't a one-episode gimmick that gets reset next week. Her appearance is permanently different from season 3 onward. The status quo is broken. And for a show that usually hits the reset button harder than most, a show where characters can die and respawn, where the universe can collapse and rebuild, this permanence matters. It's the show saying, some changes are real, some growth sticks. Some moments of vulnerability don't get taken back. And then, seasons later, in The Transformation, Season 6, Episode 22, the show comes back to this. Penny's family is fighting about whether she should stay out of her shell. Her father, Patrick, wants the shells back. It's tradition. It's safety. And the show puts Gumball right in the middle of this family conflict and asks him to pick a side. And you know what? He struggles. He doesn't have a clean answer, because the show understands that accepting someone as they are is one thing in a moonlit forest, and something completely different at a family dinner table where everyone's screaming. Patrick tells this story about a peanut girl who came out of her shell and died 80 years later from a common cold. And Penny fires back with a story about a father bird so backwards he forced his family to stay in their eggs forever, and they died of boredom. And Gumball sits between them, terrified, trying to find a middle ground in a conflict that doesn't have one. It's genuinely about tradition versus freedom, protection versus authenticity, and the fact that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who make it hardest to be yourself. I think about this a lot, actually, about how the shell is this beautiful, sweeping romantic moment, and then the transformation is the messy, uncomfortable aftermath, because that's how psychology actually works. The breakthrough is the easy part. Living with the breakthrough, integrating it into your daily life, dealing with other people's reactions to your change. That's where the real work happens. And Gumball, impulsive, impatient, make everyone happy Gumball, has to sit in the discomfort. He has to tolerate the ambiguity. He doesn't get to be the hero here. He just gets to be present. And honestly, for a character whose default mode is inserting himself into the center of every situation, that's growth. Quiet, unglamorous, psychologically significant growth. Now, here's the beautiful contradiction. Here's where the spiral tightens. Gumball can offer unconditional acceptance to Penny. He can see her. He can love her without the shell, but he cannot do this for himself. Gumball Watterson is constitutionally incapable of self-acceptance. His ego inflation, his sarcasm, his denial, his anxious attachment, all of these are strategies to avoid the one thing he cannot face: the possibility that he, as he genuinely is, might not be enough. Look at The Flower, Season 2. Gumball sees Leslie, a flower, literally a flower, being friendly with Penny, and he's so consumed by jealousy that the emotion manifests as a literal possessing entity, a green, pulsating creature that takes over his body and makes him do horrible things. He tries to frame Leslie for theft. He covers a park bench with superglue and releases plant-eating insects on him. He rips Leslie's petals off in a cafeteria in front of everyone. And the show treats the jealousy as an external force, something that possesses Gumball, something that isn't really him. They even do an exorcism. Carrie draws a circle of candles and chants, "Jealousy be gone." But here's what a psychologist would say: the jealousy is him. It didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from Gumball's deep insecurity about his worthiness of love. He sees Leslie being kind to Penny, and his immediate visceral reaction is, she'll choose him over me, because of course she will, because I'm not enough. Because under the ego, under the sarcasm, under the carefully constructed persona of the funny guy, there's a kid who doesn't believe he deserves what he has. And you know what's funny? I keep coming back to this point, but I think it's the key to understanding everything Gumball is trying to do as a show. The jealousy in The Flower is expelled through an exorcism, but Darwin is immune to possession. He can't be taken over by the jealousy spirit, and the implication, according to TV tropes and the wiki, is that Darwin has never experienced jealousy before. Not once, which makes sense, because Darwin's psychology is the inverse of Gumball's. Darwin has secure attachment. Darwin knows he's loved. Darwin doesn't need to inflate, or defend or deny, because he operates from a stable base. And why does Darwin have secure attachment? Because when he was a goldfish who grew legs and walked across the country to find Gumball, as shown in the origins, Gumball was the one who never gave up on him. Gumball gave Darwin the unconditional acceptance that Gumball himself never received. He created for his brother the psychological safety that doesn't exist for himself. That kills me every time I think about it. Gumball can build a secure base for someone else while standing on quicksand himself. And you know what makes this even more poignant? The show never draws attention to it. There's no episode where a character says, "Gumball, you gave Darwin everything you never had." There's no after-school special moment where the lesson gets spelled out. It's just there, embedded in the structure, woven into the relationship. You either see it or you don't. And the fact that the show trusts its audience, an audience that includes 7-year-olds, to see it without being told, that's respect. That's a show that believes children are smarter than most television gives them credit for. And I think that respect is, itself, therapeutic. Because one of the most damaging things about growing up is the constant condescension. The sense that adults are always simplifying things for you, always protecting you from complexity, always serving you pre-digested emotional content with the difficult parts removed. Gumball doesn't do that. It serves the complexity whole. It trusts kids to chew. And honestly, I think that's why the show's fan base skews older than you'd expect. The kids who watched it at 7 appreciated the chaos and the visual comedy. The adults who rewatch it appreciate the fact that it wasn't dumbed down for those kids. The psychological depth was always there. It was just waiting for the audience to grow into it. There's a Bacalé interview where he talks about how, when they were making the show in England, they had no idea how popular it was internationally. He says they were working in this vacuum, and the revelation that people actually liked it was a beautiful surprise. And I think that vacuum is part of why the show is so honest. They weren't performing for an audience they understood. They were making something true and hoping it would find its people. And it did. It found millions of them. And those people are now making videos like this one, at midnight, trying to articulate what the show made them feel. Okay, I need to pull back and talk about something different for a minute, because if I stay in this emotional register too long, I'm going to lose you. And honestly, one of the things I love about Gumball is that it never stays too heavy for too long. The show understands pacing the way few shows do. It'll hit you with something devastating, and then immediately follow it with a physical comedy bit that makes you snort laugh. And that rhythm, darkness into light, light into darkness, is itself psychologically meaningful. It's how humans actually process difficult emotions. We don't sit in sadness forever. We crack jokes in hospital waiting rooms. We laugh at funerals. The oscillation isn't avoidance, it's survival. So let me talk about something that seems lighter, but isn't. Gumball's relationship with school. Here's a verifiable fact. Gumball has reportedly failed middle school twice. He gets terrible grades. Miss Simeon, his teacher, who has been teaching at Elmore Junior High for hundreds of thousands of years, since she's literally an ancient ape who has been doing this since before recorded human history, actively dislikes him. She's had it out for the Wattersons specifically, because Nicole was the one student who ever challenged her, and that grudge has lasted decades. The educational system in Elmore, such as it is, has essentially given up on Gumball Watterson as a student. He's the kid that teachers stop trying with. He's the kid who gets seated at the back and ignored. And yet, when Gumball actually applies himself, as shown in the grades, he can do perfectly fine academically. When he got a job at Joyful Burger, he worked his way up to become CEO of the entire company, sold his shares, and retired as a multi-billionaire, all in one day. When he needs to be analytical, as in the mystery, he demonstrates genuine investigative skill. When he needs to be creative, he's one of the most inventive characters on the show. A psychologist would look at this pattern and immediately identify it. This is a child with high potential and low achievement, which in educational psychology is called underperformance or underachievement, and it's almost always linked to emotional or motivational factors rather than cognitive limitations. Why does Gumball underperform? Because performing, really trying, really putting himself out there means risking genuine failure. And genuine failure, for someone with Gumball's ego structure, is existentially threatening. If he tries and fails, that's evidence that he's not good enough. If he doesn't try, he can always tell himself that he could have succeeded if he wanted to. The underperformance protects the ego. It's a safety net made of apathy. This is called self-handicapping in psychology. You create obstacles for yourself so that if you fail, you can blame the obstacles instead of your ability. Gumball doesn't study. Gumball goofs around. Gumball makes sure that every failure can be attributed to not trying rather than not being capable. And the tragedy is that this strategy, while protecting him from the pain of genuine failure, also prevents him from experiencing genuine success. He's trapped in a middle zone of mediocrity because mediocrity is safe. And here's something that's been rattling around in my head since I started putting this together. The self-handicapping isn't just about school, it's about everything. Gumball self-sabotages his relationships too. Look at how long it took him to tell Penny how he felt. Look at how many times he had the opportunity to confess and just didn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because telling her would mean risking actual rejection. As long as the crush stays unspoken, it's protected. It's Schrodinger's romance, simultaneously alive and dead. And Gumball prefers that uncertainty to the definiteness of being turned down. And when he finally does tell her, in The Shell, it's not even through words. It's through a kiss, in the middle of chaos, while she's a wolf. He bypasses the verbal confession entirely because verbal confession requires vulnerability in a way that spontaneous action doesn't. Action lets you hide behind impulse. Words require premeditation. Words mean you thought about it, you chose it, you stood there knowing you might be rejected, and you said it anyway. Gumball almost never does that. I've rewatched a lot of scenes between Gumball and Penny, and there's this animation thing the show does that I genuinely love. Whenever Gumball is around Penny, especially in earlier seasons, his pupils dilate. They get huge, and his body language goes haywire. He stumbles, he stutters, his whiskers droop. And it's played for comedy, obviously, but it's also a remarkably accurate depiction of the physiological symptoms of anxiety. Dilated pupils, loss of motor control, speech disruption. These are sympathetic nervous system responses, the fight or flight system activating because the brain has categorized the romantic situation as a threat. And for Gumball, it is a threat. Love is the most dangerous thing in his world, because love means being seen, and being seen means someone might notice that you're not enough. I want to sit with this for a second, because I think it unlocks something important about how Gumball processes love in general. He has this pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, where he demonstrates love most powerfully when the other person is in crisis. He's at his best when Penny is a monster. He's at his most heroic when Darwin is in danger. He's his most tender when his family is falling apart. But when things are calm, when there's no crisis to respond to, he's distant, he's sarcastic, he's scrolling through his phone or picking fights over nothing. A psychologist would recognize this immediately as a crisis-oriented attachment style. Some people can only access their emotions under extreme circumstances. The rest of the time, the feelings are there, but they're locked behind the defenses. It takes something dramatic, a transformation, a death, a revelation, to bypass the ego and access the genuine love underneath. And then, once the crisis passes, the defenses go back up, the sarcasm returns, the distance resumes, and the person who just experienced this incredible moment of connection is left wondering if it was even real. This is why Penny's arc after the shell is so psychologically interesting. Multiple critics and fan analyses have noted that Penny becomes somewhat underutilized in the seasons following her big episode. She appears less frequently. Her relationship with Gumball settles into comfortable routine, and from a writing perspective, you could argue this is just a structural issue. The show ran out of things to do with her. But from a psychological perspective, it's painfully realistic. Crisis-oriented people invest enormous energy in the breakthrough moments and then struggle with maintenance. The exciting part is over. Now you just have to be together. And just being together doesn't trigger the same neurochemical cascade that a dramatic rescue in a dark forest does. Gumball's love is genuine. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But it's a love that burns brightest when there's something to fight for, and dims when the fight is over. And that pattern, that cycle of intensity and withdrawal, is one of the most common things therapists encounter in their work. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think it connects to something Bockelay said in an interview with Squiggly. He described Gumball as a character who is unlucky but optimistic, and that duality is the whole character in a nutshell. Gumball expects things to go wrong. He has a kind of learned pessimism about outcomes, but he also never fully gives up, because deep down, beneath all the defense mechanisms and ego inflation, there's an irreducible optimism that keeps him going. He believes things could be better. He just doesn't believe he's the one who can make them better. And that, right there, is the thing that breaks my heart about this character, because it means every scheme, every plan, every chaotic intervention isn't really about solving problems. It's about proving to himself that he can solve problems. Every adventure is a test that he sets up unconsciously, hoping to pass, expecting to fail, and then retroactively reframing the failure as, well, I didn't really try. It's exhausting. And it's so incredibly, specifically, precisely what being 12 years old feels like that I sometimes forget I'm watching a cartoon about a blue cat. Let me pull the spiral outward a bit and talk about the show's treatment of emotional regulation, because this is one of those areas where the psychology goes from subtext to text, where the show isn't just hinting at something, it's directly depicting it. The Joy, Season 3, Episode 4. This is the zombie episode. Richard gives Gumball and Darwin a wonder hug, because it's Monday and everyone's depressed, and the hug is so overwhelming that it infects them with a contagious happiness virus. They start smiling uncontrollably. Their eyes glaze over. They ooze rainbow-colored goo. And then they start spreading it, through hugs, to every other student in the school. Miss Simeon is the only one who isn't infected, and she spends the episode trying to survive what is, structurally, a horror movie. Found footage cameras, dark corridors, students shambling toward her with terrifying grins. Here's the thing. The show presents uncontrollable happiness as a disease, as something parasitic and destructive. And that is, whether the writers specifically intended this or not, an extraordinarily astute observation about emotional regulation. Because happiness that you can't control, that overwhelms your other functions, that you're compelled to spread regardless of whether other people want it, that's mania. That's the high end of an emotional spectrum that has depression at the other end. And the fact that the trigger is Richard's hug, the most well-intentioned gesture imaginable, makes it even more psychologically accurate, because overwhelming emotions often come from love. They come from someone trying to help, and they can still be destructive. I need you to think about what this show just pulled off on a children's network. It made an episode where excessive, uncontrollable happiness is depicted as a communicable disease that turns people into mindless, oozing shells of their former selves. It's saying, emotions need regulation, even good ones, even love. Without regulation, even positive emotions become consuming. And then in the downer, the show does the opposite. Excessive sadness consumes Gumball's entire reality. So across these 2 episodes, the show has presented a complete model of emotional dysregulation. Too much joy destroys you. Too much sadness destroys you. The healthy state is somewhere in between, and getting there requires awareness, connection, and the willingness to let your emotions exist without letting them take over. That's not just good storytelling. That's basically a summary of dialectical behavior therapy. And now, I want to talk about growing up, because this is where the show does something that I think most people miss, and it's one of the most psychologically significant themes running through the entire series. The Kids, Season 3, Episode 1. The episode where Gumball and Darwin's voices start breaking. This was the real-world transition episode. Logan Grove and Kwesi Boki, the original voice actors for Gumball and Darwin, had gone through puberty, and the show needed to change actors. Most shows just do it quietly. Gumball made an entire episode about it. Gumball and Darwin go to a doctor who explains that their voices are changing because they're growing up, and that only 1% of the world's population, mostly TV characters, never grows up. And Gumball's reaction is terror. Pure, unfiltered terror at the idea of getting older. He and Darwin try to cram as much childhood as possible into a single day. They eat candy, they loiter at the mall, they sing a song called Make the Most of It that's genuinely beautiful and genuinely sad. And then the twist. By the end, Gumball and Darwin accept growing up. They're ready. They start singing about the benefits of getting older, and their voices change to sound younger than before. The doctor was wrong. They're in that 1%. They won't age. And the episode ends on this brilliantly ambiguous note, where their excitement about staying young forever slowly curdles into something like horror. They're going to be children forever. The thing they were afraid of losing, their childhood, is now the thing they're trapped in. Look, I've rewatched this episode probably 8 times putting this together, and I keep noticing new things in the background. But the main thing, the thing a psychologist would fixate on, is what the episode says about developmental arrest. In psychology, developmental arrest is when emotional or psychological growth stops at a particular stage, even as the person physically ages. And The Kids is the show literally encoding its own premise, that Gumball will never grow up, as a psychological condition. He's stuck. He's frozen at 12. And the show frames this as simultaneously a gift and a curse. Because Gumball can't grow up. He has Aesop amnesia. He learns lessons and forgets them. He makes the same mistakes across seasons. His character development is cyclical rather than linear. And while this is partly a function of episodic television, the reset button exists for structural reasons. The show is self-aware enough to know that this stasis is itself a statement about childhood, about the experience of being a kid, and feeling like you're learning the same lessons over and over, about how growth isn't a straight line, about how sometimes you understand something perfectly on Monday and have completely forgotten it by Friday. A psychologist working with children would recognize this pattern immediately. Kids don't develop in neat stages. They oscillate, they progress, and regress. They understand empathy in one context and completely fail at it in another. Gumball's inconsistency isn't a flaw in the writing, it's a feature. It's the most honest representation of how children actually experience psychological growth that I've seen in animation. Let me come at this from another angle. I want to talk about what Gumball is afraid of. Not surface level fears, not Tina Rex chasing him or Miss Simeon failing him. Deep fears, the things that keep him up at night. And I think the show tells us, if we're paying attention. Fear number 1, being forgotten. Rob, Gumball's arch nemesis, is a character who was literally erased from existence because the world forgot about him. He was a background character so minor that the universe itself deemed him unnecessary and sent him to the void, a dimension that consumes things the world considers mistakes. Rob escaped, but he came back disfigured. His body glitched, like a corrupted file. Part of his face is covered in static. He looks like what happens when the animation renders incorrectly and nobody bothers to fix it. And Gumball's initial reaction to Rob wasn't sympathy. In The Pony, Season 2, Gumball and Darwin couldn't even remember Rob's name. They called him the wrong thing. They made him a hollow promise. They kicked him down a manhole. And these tiny cruelties, the kind of casual social negligence that happens every day in every middle school, are what turned Rob into a villain. He was discarded, and the discarding destroyed him. And I want to spend some time on Rob here, because from a psychological perspective, Rob might be the most important character in the entire show for understanding Gumball. Not because of what Rob does, but because of what Rob represents. In Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, there's a concept called the shadow. The shadow is the part of yourself that you refuse to acknowledge. It contains your worst qualities, your deepest fears, your most shameful impulses. And Jung argued that the shadow doesn't just sit there passively. It gets projected outward, onto other people. The things you hate most in others are often the things you can't face in yourself. Rob is Gumball's shadow, and the show makes this almost explicit. Think about who Rob was before the Void. He was a background character, forgettable, unimportant. Nobody noticed him. Nobody cared. He existed in the margins of other people's stories, exactly the way Gumball fears existing. When Rob was sent to the Void, the universe was essentially saying, "You don't matter enough to keep around." And that's Gumball's nightmare. That's the thing he builds every defense mechanism to prevent. So when Rob comes back damaged, glitching, covered in static, when he becomes Gumball's villain, what's really happening, psychologically, is that Gumball is confronting the version of himself that he's terrified of becoming. Rob is what happens when nobody sees you. Rob is the answer to the question, what if everyone forgot? And look at how Gumball treats Rob across the series. In The Nobody, Season 4, Gumball discovers Rob hiding in their house, amnesiac and broken. And for a brief, remarkable moment, Gumball shows genuine empathy. He tries to help. He sees a person in pain and responds with kindness. But then, and this is where the psychology gets really sharp, Gumball can't sustain it. He can't maintain the empathy, because maintaining it would mean acknowledging the part of himself that Rob represents. So the relationship deteriorates. Rob becomes the villain. Gumball becomes the hero. And the shadow gets pushed back into the darkness, where Gumball doesn't have to look at it. In The Nemesis, Gumball actually helps Rob become a better villain. He literally coaches his own arch-nemesis on how to be more threatening. And you could read this as just a funny episode. And it is a funny episode. It's hilarious. But the psychological subtext is extraordinary. Gumball needs Rob to be a villain, because he needs someone to fight. If Rob isn't a villain, he's just a broken person who reminds Gumball of his own fragility. By helping Rob become threatening, Gumball transforms his shadow from something pathetic and unsettling into something dramatic and heroic. Now, he's not avoiding a damaged person. He's battling an arch-nemesis. The narrative reframe protects the ego. And then, the rerun. Season 4. This is the one where Rob gets the universal remote and wreaks genuine havoc on reality. He fast-forwards time, rewinds it, pauses people, changes channels, and in the process, he temporarily kills Darwin. And Gumball, the Gumball who can't sustain empathy for Rob, who needs Rob to be a villain, goes into an absolute rage. He chases Rob through a collapsing timeline. He pushes Rob into the void, and then he feels guilty. He goes in after him. He tries to save the person he just condemned. And here's what kills me. When Gumball reaches out to save Rob from the void, Rob has a choice. He can take Gumball's hand and be saved, which means accepting help from the person he hates most. Or he can use the universal remote to rewind time and undo all the damage, which means erasing the moment of connection entirely. He chooses to rewind. He destroys the remote so it can't be used again, and time resets to before any of it happened. Gumball doesn't remember the void. He doesn't remember saving Rob, and Rob's hatred is reestablished. Look, I've watched a lot of cartoons, and this might be the most existentially terrifying thing I've ever seen in one aimed at kids. Not because of the action or the stakes, but because of what it says about reconciliation. Sometimes the person you've wronged can't accept your help. Sometimes the damage you've done, or the damage the universe has done, is too deep for a handshake to fix. Sometimes the shadow can't be integrated. It can only be survived. And then the series finale, the Inquisition. Rob returns, disguised as a live-action human called Superintendent Evil, and he tries to transform everyone into humans so they can escape to the other place before the Void destroys Elmore. He's not a villain anymore. He's trying to save everyone, but nobody listens. Nobody trusts the damaged, glitchy kid who spent years trying to destroy them. Tina knocks him unconscious before he can explain, and he wakes up alone in the school, screaming that transformation was their only chance, and the Void opens beneath him and swallows him. Rob, the forgotten one, the one who tried to matter, who tried every possible approach from villainy to heroism, falls into non-existence trying to save people who won't listen to him. If you're watching this late at night and that doesn't hit different, I don't know what will. I think Gumball sees himself in Rob, even if he'd never admit it. Because Gumball's deepest fear is exactly what happened to Rob: becoming irrelevant, becoming a background character in someone else's story, being so forgettable that the universe erases you. And this fear drives so much of his behavior: the attention seeking, the ego inflation, the refusal to let anyone else be the protagonist. If you're loud enough, if you're central enough, if you make sure everyone is looking at you, you can't be forgotten. You can't be sent to the Void. Fear number 2, that his family doesn't actually need him. This one runs deep, and it surfaces in surprising places. In The Rival, Gumball and Darwin discover through flashback that baby Anais was so much smarter and more competent than them that they were essentially redundant from the moment she was born. In The Boredom, Gumball can't stand the idea of a day without excitement, because a boring day is a day without purpose. In episode after episode, Gumball's need to create chaos is partly driven by the unconscious belief that if things are calm, he's unnecessary. Chaos makes him essential. Problems make him the problem solver, even if he's also the problem creator. Fear number 3, that the world he lives in isn't real. And this is where the show gets genuinely existential, and where the psychological analysis crosses into philosophy, and where I think the amazing world of Gumball does something that no other children's show has ever attempted with this level of ambition. The Void, the dimension of things the world considers mistakes, the place where forgotten characters go. The show establishes in The Void, Season 3, that Elmore itself exists in a kind of curated reality. Things that don't belong get removed. Molly's house vanishes. Rob gets erased. Old character designs from the show's early development are visible floating in the Void's expanse, as if the production process itself is part of the show's reality. And in The Inquisition, the original series finale, June 2019, Rob, disguised as Superintendent Evil, tries to turn everyone into live-action humans so they can escape to the other place before the Void consumes Elmore entirely. He's trying to save them. He's the villain who's actually the hero, and nobody listens to him. Nobody believes him, and he falls into the Void screaming. And the last thing he says is, "Oh no, it started." Think about what this means for Gumball's psychology. He lives in a world that he knows, on some level, is unstable. A world where people can be erased, where mistakes get consumed by an interdimensional garbage disposal, where reality itself is maintained by forces beyond anyone's understanding. And in The Rewrite, the Season 7 resolution, it's revealed that if anyone in Elmore figures out they're fictional, the Void will destroy everything. Gumball's anxiety isn't just about school or social status or whether Penny likes him. His anxiety is existential. He lives in a world where existence itself is contingent, where being deemed a mistake means annihilation. And while the show plays this for meta-comedy, and it's brilliant comedy, don't get me wrong, the psychological underpinning is genuine existential dread. A psychologist influenced by existential therapy, people like Irvin Yalom or Rollo May, would recognize Gumball's defensive structures as responses to what Yalom called the givens of existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Gumball copes with the threat of non-existence, the Void, through denial, refusing to acknowledge it, meaning-making, creating narratives where he's the hero, and connection, clinging to his family and friends. I'm going to be honest with you. I started making this video because I thought it'd be fun, a lighthearted thing about cartoon psychology. And then I actually started looking at Gumball through this lens, and I found something I wasn't expecting. I found a character who is genuinely, comprehensively, psychologically coherent. Not as a clinical case study. He's too exaggerated and inconsistent for that, but as a portrait of what it feels like to be a child. The fear, the ego, the love, the confusion, the desperate need to matter, the terror that you don't. All of it is here. All of it is animated in 2 dimensions and set against real-world photographs. And it should not work, and it does. Let me keep spiraling. I want to talk about how Gumball treats other people, because this is where a psychologist's assessment would get really interesting. Because Gumball is capable of remarkable cruelty and remarkable kindness, sometimes in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene. In The Laziest, Season 1, Gumball and Darwin systematically destroy Larry Needlemeyer's life, his car, his relationship, his livelihood, all to win a competition about who can be the laziest. They don't intend malice. They're not trying to hurt Larry. They're just so absorbed in their own narrative that Larry's suffering is invisible to them, and the show doesn't flinch from showing us Larry's pain. There's a moment where Larry, having lost everything, looks at the camera with this expression that is way too real for a character who is literally a rock with eyes. And then, in The Origins, Gumball's love for Darwin is so powerful, so pure, that it literally gives Darwin the ability to survive outside water, grow legs, and walk across the country to find him. Their bond is supernatural. It transcends physics. A goldfish grows lungs because a child refused to stop loving him. How do you reconcile these two things? How is Gumball both the kid who destroys Larry's life without noticing and the kid whose love creates miracles? A psychologist would say the same way all of us are. The same way anyone with an anxious attachment style can be simultaneously the most devoted and the most oblivious person in the room. Gumball's attention is a spotlight. When it's on you, it's blinding. When it's not on you, you're in darkness. And he doesn't control the spotlight. His ego does. His anxiety does. His emotional state in any given moment determines who exists and who doesn't. This is why Gumball can treat Penny with breathtaking tenderness in The Shell, and then barely register her existence in subsequent episodes. This is why he can save Darwin from the void, and then casually endanger him through stupid schemes. The love is real, but it's reactive, not proactive. It activates when triggered, and goes dormant when the trigger passes. And for the people in Gumball's life, this creates a pattern of intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive and destabilizing form of relationship dynamic in psychology. Intermittent reinforcement is when rewards come unpredictably. Sometimes you get affection, sometimes you get neglect, and you never know which one is coming. Psychologists have known since B.F. Skinner's work in the 1930s that this pattern creates the strongest attachment. It's why gambling is addictive. It's why toxic relationships are hard to leave. And it's why everyone in Gumball's orbit, Penny, Darwin, Tobias, even Mr. Robinson, stays. Because every so often, Gumball turns that spotlight on them, and they feel like the most important person in the world. And that feeling is worth all the darkness in between. Okay, I need to come at the family one more time, because there's an aspect of it I haven't touched yet, and it's maybe the most important one: Aeneas. Aeneas Watterson is 4 years old, attends a grade above her 12-year-old brothers, and is by any measure the most intelligent person in the Watterson household. She's also, psychologically, the most damaged, or at least the most at risk. Because here's the thing about being the smart one in a dysfunctional family. You become the emotional regulator. You become the one who sees all the patterns, who understands all the dynamics, who knows exactly what's going wrong and why. And you're 4 years old. You don't have the emotional resources to process what you're observing. The show depicts this brilliantly, though mostly in passing. Aeneas is often the only sane person in the room. She sees through schemes, predicts outcomes, and understands motivations that the rest of the family misses. And nobody listens to her. Not because she's wrong, she's almost never wrong, but because she's the youngest. And in the Watterson family system, being right doesn't grant you authority. A psychologist would recognize Aeneas as occupying the lost child or hero child role in the family system. She compensates for the family's chaos by being excessively competent, but the competence isolates her. She doesn't have friends her own age. Her social skills are underdeveloped despite her intellectual precocity. And the show, particularly in later seasons, starts to show the cracks, moments where Aeneas's competence gives way to loneliness, where her intelligence becomes a wall between her and connection. And Gumball, for all his faults, for all his ego, for all his blindness, loves Aeneas with a ferocity that borders on violence. In The Parasite, when he thinks someone is hurting his sister, he nearly poisons them. In The Rival, the flashback shows him instinctively protecting baby Aeneas, even when he was threatened himself. His protective instinct toward her is one of the purest expressions of his character. But And this is the psychological complexity the show handles so well. His protection is also a form of control. Big brother energy can tip into paternalism. And Gumball's anxiety about his own competence sometimes manifests as an insistence that Anais needs him, when in reality, she's the one holding things together. And I want to sit with Anais for another minute, because her position in the family illuminates something crucial about Gumball. In psychology, there's a concept called the identified patient, the family member who displays symptoms that actually belong to the whole system. In most dysfunctional families, one person gets designated as the problem. And in the Watterson household, that person is Gumball. He's the troublemaker. He's the one who causes chaos. He's the one who gets detention, fails tests, breaks things. But Anais sees the full picture. She sees that Gumball's chaos is a response to the system, not the cause of it. And she sees that her own goodness, her intelligence, her maturity, her reliability, is also a response to the system. She's good because someone has to be. She's smart because someone has to compensate for Richard's incompetence. And here's the thing nobody talks about. Anais's intelligence is isolating her. She's 4 years old in a class with older kids. She has no friends her own age. Her social interactions are largely limited to her brothers, who are 8 years older and treat her alternatively as a mascot and an oracle. She's the gifted kid who's simultaneously celebrated and neglected. Celebrated for what she can do, neglected for who she is. And any child psychologist will tell you that this pattern creates a specific kind of loneliness that's very hard to address, because the child learns that their worth is their function. They're valued for being smart, not for being themselves. Sound familiar? It should, because it's exactly what happened to Nicole. Nicole's parents valued her for her achievements. Nicole responded by achieving obsessively, and now Nicole's daughter is trapped in the same pattern, 1 generation later. The spiral repeats. You know what's funny is, and by funny I mean devastating, every Watterson is running from the same thing. They just run in different directions. Nicole runs toward control. Richard runs toward avoidance. Gumball runs toward spectacle. Darwin runs toward people. And Anais runs toward information. 5 different escape routes from the same underlying terror. The fear that they're not a real family. That what holds them together is obligation and proximity, not genuine connection. And the show answers this fear over and over in its own chaotic way. Every time a Watterson episode threatens to tear the family apart, it ends with them together. Not because they've solved their problems. Not because they've grown or changed or learned anything they'll remember next week, but because they choose each other again and again, imperfectly, messily, with food fights and shouting, and Nicole nearly punching through a wall. They choose each other. The Choices ends with Nicole unpausing from her flashback and starting a food fight with her family. After an entire episode of contemplating alternate lives where she was rich, powerful, successful, she looks at the reality she has and declares a food war. That's the choice, not perfection, connection. I want to circle back now and talk about something I've been skirting around, which is the show's treatment of masculinity, because it's actually one of the most psychologically interesting threads in the entire series, and it runs directly through Gumball. Richard Watterson is, by any conventional measure, a failure of masculinity. He's lazy. He's incompetent. He can't provide for his family. He has no career, no ambitions, no skills. He's been described as a bumbling dad in the tradition of Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin. But unlike those characters, Richard's inadequacy isn't just played for laughs. It's explored. It's contextualized. It's given a psychological origin. In The Authority, it's revealed that Granny JoJo sheltered Richard his entire life, to the point where he never developed basic life skills. She was so protective that she essentially disabled him. And in The Man, we learn that Richard's biological father, Frankie, walked out on the family when Richard was young, claiming he was going out for milk. Richard believed this, literally continued to believe his father was buying milk, well into adulthood. The denial wasn't stupidity, it was survival. A child whose father abandons him has 2 choices: face the abandonment or construct a reality where it didn't happen. Richard chose construction, and here's what a psychologist would note. Richard's childishness isn't a personality trait, it's an adaptation. He was never allowed to grow up by one parent and was abandoned by the other. He developed into a person who can only function in a caretaker-dependent relationship, first with JoJo, then with Nicole. He needs someone to manage him, not because he's incapable, but because he learned very early that capability is dangerous. In Richard's psychological economy, being competent means being responsible, and being responsible means being the kind of person who could leave, like his father did. So Richard stays childish. He stays dependent. He stays, period. And that, his unwavering presence, is actually his greatest contribution to the family. Richard is the one person in the Watterson household who will never, under any circumstances, leave. He might burn the house down. He might put cement in the cupcakes. He might cause the literal apocalypse through his laziness, as in the job. But he will be there. He will always be there. And Gumball knows this. On some level, conscious or not, Gumball knows that Richard's reliability is more important than his competence. Because for a child with anxious attachment, presence is everything. You can survive an incompetent parent. You can't survive an absent one. But here's where it gets complicated. Because Gumball is also ashamed of Richard. The hero makes this explicit. Gumball can't name a single thing his father is good at. When his friends brag about their dads, Gumball has nothing. And the shame of that, the feeling of having a father you love but can't respect, a father whose presence saves you, but whose incompetence humiliates you, is one of the most painful and least discussed aspects of childhood. And the show, to its enormous credit, doesn't resolve this cleanly. Richard saves Gumball from a car crusher in The Hero, and Gumball cries and calls him his hero. But then Richard gets his sleeve nailed to the wall of the shed, because he's Richard, and of course, he does. The heroism and the incompetence coexist. They don't cancel each other out, and Gumball has to live with both. This is one of those episodes I think about at random moments, and just start feeling things I wasn't prepared for. Because the show is asking a question that most children's media won't touch. What do you do when you love someone who embarrasses you? How do you hold both feelings at once? How do you honor the presence while acknowledging the inadequacy? And I think the answer the show gives, implicitly, through its structure rather than its dialogue, is you just do. You hold both. You don't resolve the contradiction. You live in it. That's not a lesson. That's wisdom. Okay, I think I need to talk about something that pulls several of these threads together, and then we'll start bringing this home. I want to talk about the animation. I know this is supposed to be about psychology, but the animation is the psychology. The way Gumball looks is the way Gumball feels. And this is the thing that makes the amazing world of Gumball unique, not just among cartoons, but among all narrative art. Every character in this show exists in a different animation style. Gumball is 2D drawn. Darwin is 2D drawn. The backgrounds are photographs of real locations. Banana Joe is a simpler, almost flash animated character. Tina Rex is 3D CGI. Sussy is a live-action chin with googly eyes. The show's visual language is chaos. The kind of chaos that shouldn't work, that should be ugly and distracting, but instead feels exactly like what childhood looks like from the inside. Because that's the thing. When you're a kid, the world doesn't have a consistent visual language. Everything looks different. Your school looks different from your house. Your friends look different from your family. The cartoon you watch looks different from the street outside your window. And your brain, your developing, overwhelmed, pattern-seeking brain, is trying to make all of these different visual inputs cohere into a single reality. And it doesn't always succeed. The world feels patchy, inconsistent, like different layers of different media layered on top of each other. That's what Elmore looks like. Elmore is the visual equivalent of a child's perception, and Gumball, a flat, hand-drawn character standing on a photographed sidewalk, talking to a 3D cactus, is the embodiment of that perception. He doesn't belong in the world he inhabits. He knows he doesn't belong, and he keeps going anyway. A psychologist who studies perception would have a field day with this show. The mixed media approach isn't just aesthetic, it's phenomenological. It's depicting how reality is experienced by a consciousness that hasn't yet learned to smooth out the contradictions. Adults see a coherent world because their brains have learned to suppress the seams. Kids see the seams. Kids see the world the way Elmore looks, beautiful, chaotic, slightly wrong, and absolutely worth exploring. And Gumball, with his huge eyes and his oversized head and his tiny body, he looks like pure attention. He looks like a child looking at the world. And the world looks back at him with photographs and CGI and puppetry and anime parodies and pixel art and stop motion and live action chin puppets. And it says, "Good luck making sense of this, kid." And that's the show. That's the whole show. A child trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense, using every psychological tool available to him. Ego, sarcasm, love, denial, anxiety, creativity, stubbornness, and usually failing, and trying again tomorrow. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a video about a cartoon. This is about what it means to be a person who hasn't figured themselves out yet. And the comforting truth, the thing the show whispers underneath all the chaos and the meta-comedy and the existential dread, is that nobody has. Nobody has figured themselves out. We're all Gumball, standing on a photographed sidewalk, animated in a style that doesn't match our surroundings, trying to find a way to belong. Let me bring this home. I need to talk about one more thing before I start bringing this home. And it's the thing that ties everything together. The thing that a psychologist would probably identify as the central therapeutic issue if Gumball Watterson ever walked into their office. Gumball doesn't know who he is. I don't mean this in the vague, existential sense. I mean it specifically. The show systematically deconstructs every aspect of his identity and finds nothing stable underneath. His name isn't real. It's a nickname. His legal name was Zach, which he changed because the Zach personality tried to kill him. His appearance changes across seasons. Rounder eyes, bigger head, different proportions. His voice has been performed by 4 different actors. His personality shifts between seasons, sometimes between episodes. He is, as a character, in constant flux, and the show knows this. In the rewrite, the Season 7 resolution, Gumball and Darwin discover plot holes in their own lives. The window that doesn't match the interior. The fact that they haven't had a birthday in 7 years. The voice actor changes. They start to piece together the truth that they're fictional characters in a show. And the discovery nearly destroys their world. For a psychologist, this is identity diffusion, a state described by developmental psychologist Erik Erikson as the failure to achieve a stable sense of self. Erikson argued that the primary task of adolescence is identity formation, and that failure to form a coherent identity leads to role confusion, anxiety, and what he called psychosocial moratorium, a period of exploration that can become paralyzing if it never resolves. Gumball is perpetually in moratorium. He tries on identities. Zach, the tough guy, the romantic hero, the class clown, the existential philosopher, and none of them stick. None of them feel like him. Because him is an unstable category. Because he's 12 years old, and he's terrified, and he's brilliant, and he's stupid, and he loves deeply, and selfishly, and generously, and blindly. And he lives in a world where the ground can open up and swallow you if you're not important enough to keep around. And here's something I want to linger on, because I think it's the deepest layer of the show's psychological sophistication, and it connects everything we've been talking about tonight. The Amazing World of Gumball is a show about a character who is, on some level, aware that he's a character. The meta-awareness, the breaking of the fourth wall, the references to the show's own production, the acknowledgement of voice actor changes and animation style shifts, isn't just a comedy device. It's a psychological condition. In clinical psychology, there's a condition called depersonalization, the feeling that you're watching yourself from outside your own body, that your life is happening to someone else, that you're acting in a play rather than living a life. It's associated with anxiety disorders, trauma responses, and identity disturbance. And depersonalization is, in a very real sense, the experience of being a fictional character who suspects they're fictional. Gumball's occasional moments of meta-awareness, the moments where he seems to sense the camera, or acknowledge the structure of the episode, or notice that the world around him doesn't quite make sense. These aren't just jokes. They're depersonalization events. They're moments where the gap between his experience and his reality becomes visible, where the seams of his world show through, and he has to decide whether to pull at the thread or pretend he didn't see it. And the show's answer, particularly in the rewrite, is stark. If you pull at the thread, the world unravels. If you realize you're fictional, the void consumes everything. The only safe response to existential awareness is to choose ignorance, to go back to your life, to keep living as if it's real, because the alternative is annihilation. And I know that sounds bleak, but here's where I think the show actually offers something profound, something that transcends the specific context of a cartoon about a blue cat. Because the choice to live as if your life is real, even when you suspect it might not be, even when the existential ground feels unstable beneath your feet. That's not ignorance. That's courage. That's the most fundamental form of psychological resilience there is. Every human being, at some point, bumps up against the question, does any of this matter? And every human being who continues to live, to love, to create, to argue about cartoons on the internet at 2 in the morning, they're making the same choice Gumball makes. They're choosing to keep going. Not because they've solved the philosophical problem, but because the alternative is the void. And I think Gumball, if he could articulate this, which he can't, because he's 12 and he'd rather eat cereal and watch TV, would say something like, yeah, the world might not be real, but my family is. Darwin is. Penny is. The feeling of running down the street with your brother on a sunny day is. And that's enough. It has to be. Because the darkness is always there, and it'll always be there. And the only thing you can do is make sure you're not standing in it alone. This brings me to something I want to say about the show's relationship with its audience, because I think it's psychologically significant in a way that extends beyond the fiction. The Amazing World of Gumball premiered on Cartoon Network in May 2011. It ran for 6 seasons until 2019. The kids who grew up watching it, the kids who were Gumball's age when the show started, are now in their 20s. They grew up. Gumball didn't. And there's something about that asymmetry that creates a very specific emotional relationship between the viewer and the character. When you go back and watch Gumball as an adult, you're watching yourself. Not literally, not unless you're a blue cat, but emotionally. You're watching a version of yourself that's still stuck at 12, still anxious, still performing, still trying to figure out who they are. And there's a tenderness in that recognition, a kind of retroactive compassion for the child you were. You watch Gumball make the same mistakes you made, fear the same fears you feared, love the same desperate, clumsy, beautiful way you loved, and you think, oh, I was okay. I was always okay. I just didn't know it yet. And that, maybe more than any specific psychological concept or clinical framework, is what a psychologist would say about Gumball Watterson. They'd say, he's okay. He's struggling, and he's coping. And some of his coping strategies are better than others. And his family is a mess. And his world is unstable. And his ego is enormous and fragile at the same time. But he's okay. He's a kid. And kids are resilient in ways that adults forget to be. The research on childhood resilience, and this is real, peer-reviewed research, consistently finds that the single most important factor in a child's long-term well-being isn't the absence of adversity. It's the presence of at least one stable, caring relationship. One person who shows up, one person who stays. Gumball has that. He has Darwin. He has Nicole, even with her flaws. He has Richard, even with his incompetence. He has a family that falls apart and comes back together, that shouts and fights and throws food and hugs too tight. He has a world that might be fictional, and friends who might be animated in different styles, and a name that might not be real. But he has people who love him. And that's the foundation. Everything else, the anxiety, the ego, the identity confusion, the existential dread, all of it is manageable as long as the foundation holds. And the foundation holds. In 240 episodes and counting, across 6 seasons, and a revival and whatever comes next, the foundation holds. The Wattersons choose each other every time. And I genuinely think that this is why The Amazing World of Gumball resonates with so many people who are no longer children. Because that feeling of not knowing who you are, of trying on selves and discarding them, of loving people poorly and completely, of being anxious and inflated and terrified and optimistic all at the same time, that's not just childhood, that's being alive. And maybe that's the most psychological thing about Gumball. Not any single disorder or defense mechanism or attachment style, but the totality, the mess, the glorious, contradictory, animated in 12 different styles mess of being a person who hasn't figured it out yet and might never figure it out and keeps going anyway. But before I bring us all the way back to where we started, I want to do one more thing. I want to talk about Darwin, because I've mentioned him throughout this video as Gumball's counterpoint, as the secure attachment mirror, as the moral compass. And all of that's true. But Darwin deserves his own psychological analysis, because what the show does with Darwin is almost as impressive as what it does with Gumball. It's just quieter. Darwin Watterson is a goldfish who sprouted legs, grew lungs, developed speech, and walked across the entire country to find his way back to Gumball. He was originally a pet. He was flushed down a toilet, or escaped, depending on which version of the origin you're watching. And through sheer force of bond, he evolved into a person. The show presents this as a fairy tale, as a miracle, as comedy. But think about what it means psychologically. Darwin's entire existence as a sentient being is predicated on one person's love. He became who he is because Gumball needed him. His consciousness, his legs, his lungs, his voice, they were all born from attachment. He is, quite literally, a creature made of love. And that sounds beautiful, and it is. But it also creates a very specific psychological dynamic that the show explores with increasing sophistication as it goes on. Because if your entire identity was created by someone else's need for you, who are you when that person doesn't need you? What happens to a being whose existence is contingent on a relationship? In The Triangle, Season 3, Darwin joins the school marching band and discovers he's genuinely talented. He has a gift that has nothing to do with Gumball, and Gumball's reaction is jealousy. Not the supernatural, possessing kind from the flower, just regular, ugly, human jealousy. He doesn't want Darwin to have something that doesn't involve him. And Darwin, pure, loyal, selfless Darwin, doesn't know how to have a life that doesn't revolve around his brother. A psychologist would recognize this as a codependent relationship, not in the casual way people use the term, but in the clinical sense. Darwin and Gumball are emotionally enmeshed to a degree that limits both of their development. Gumball can't tolerate Darwin's independence. Darwin can't pursue independence without guilt. They're locked into complementary roles. Gumball as the impulsive leader, Darwin as the moral conscience. And any deviation from those roles threatens the relationship's stability. And the show knows this. In The Words, Season 2, Darwin discovers that he's been suppressing negative emotions his entire life. He's been so focused on being kind, on being the good one, on being Gumball's moral anchor, that he's never expressed frustration or anger or resentment. And when he finally does, when he starts saying what he actually thinks, it comes out as a torrent of harsh, unfiltered truth that hurts everyone around him. He calls people out on things they didn't want to hear. He says the quiet parts loud. And it's terrible. It's funny, but it's terrible. Because what The Words is showing us is the cost of being the emotionally regulated one. Darwin carries everyone else's feelings. He absorbs Gumball's anxiety, Nicole's anger, Richard's neediness. He's the family's emotional sponge. And sponges, eventually, become saturated. When Darwin finally wrings himself out, what comes out isn't pretty. It's accumulated bitterness, years of unspoken truths. And the show frames this as simultaneously liberating and destructive, because that's exactly what it is when a chronically suppressed person finally speaks their mind. And here's what connects Darwin back to Gumball's psychology. They need each other in ways that are both healthy and limiting. Gumball needs Darwin as a conscience, as a tether, as proof that he's capable of sustaining a loving relationship. Darwin needs Gumball as a purpose, as a source of adventure, as the chaos that gives his stability meaning. Without Gumball, Darwin might be happier, but he'd also be less alive. Without Darwin, Gumball might be freer, but he'd also be more dangerous. A psychologist would call this a complementary relationship pattern. Each person fills a gap in the other. The extrovert needs the introvert. The risk taker needs the cautious one. The ego needs the superego. And the danger of complementary patterns is that they can ossify. They can become so rigid that neither person can grow beyond their designated role. Darwin can never be reckless. Gumball can never be careful. They're trapped in a dynamic that serves them both and limits them both. And I think the show, particularly in later seasons and into the wonderfully weird world of Gumball, which premiered on Hulu in July 2025, starts to push against this. It starts giving Darwin moments of genuine independence. It starts letting Gumball make moral choices without Darwin's guidance. It's slowly, carefully untangling the codependence, not by separating them, but by expanding who each of them can be within the relationship. That's growth. Real, sustainable, psychologically credible growth. And it happens so gradually that you might not notice it unless you're looking for it. I also want to touch on something that I think gets overlooked in discussions about this show, and it's the role that Elmore itself plays as a psychological environment. Because Elmore isn't just a setting, Elmore is a character, and it's a deeply disturbed one. Think about it. This is a town where the grocery store clerk, Larry, works every single job, where the police are incompetent, where the school is run by a 300,000-year-old ape who hates children, where the natural laws of physics are suggestions, where people die and come back, where buildings change shape, where reality is maintained by an unseen force that can erase anything it deems a mistake. Elmore is, psychologically speaking, an environment of radical unpredictability. And developmental psychology has a lot to say about what happens to children raised in unpredictable environments. The research, going back to the ACE studies in the 1990s and John Bowlby's attachment work before that, consistently shows that children in chaotic environments develop hypervigilance, difficulty with emotional regulation, and challenges with trust. They're constantly scanning for threats. They have trouble relaxing. They develop coping strategies that are effective in chaos, but maladaptive in stability. And isn't that exactly what we see with Gumball? He's hypervigilant. He's anxious. He has difficulty trusting that good things will last. He's great in a crisis and terrible when things are calm. These aren't random character traits. They're the predictable psychological outcomes of growing up in a world where the ground literally might disappear beneath you. The fact that Elmore is also hilarious and colorful and full of wonder, that doesn't contradict the chaos. It amplifies it, because the most disorienting environments aren't the consistently terrible ones. The most disorienting environments are the ones that alternate between wonderful and frightening without warning. The ones where you never know whether walking out your front door will lead to a normal day or an apocalypse. That's Elmore, and that's Gumball's nervous system, externalized as a town. I think about this whenever people dismiss Gumball as just a comedy. It is a comedy. It's one of the funniest shows ever made. But the comedy comes from a place of genuine psychological truth. The jokes work because the characters are real underneath the absurdity. The absurdity works because the emotions are honest underneath the jokes. And the whole thing holds together because somewhere in a studio in London, a French-English animator named Ben Bocquelet was drawing pictures of his own family and turning them into something universal. Bocquelet once told an interviewer that he wanted kids watching the show to believe Elmore was real. He wanted them to ask their parents to go on holiday there. He wanted them to feel like they could walk down the street and bump into Gumball. And I think he succeeded. Not because Elmore looks real, because it absolutely doesn't, but because it feels real. It feels like the inside of a child's mind. And what's more real than that? Let me talk for a moment about something the show does that I think deserves more attention from people who study psychology and media, and that's its treatment of therapy itself. Mr. Small, the school counselor, is a hippie cloud of new age nonsense. He burns incense. He talks about chakras. He recommends meditation and positive energy. And he is, by any professional standard, completely useless. He gives terrible advice. He misdiagnoses constantly. His therapeutic interventions are at best harmless and at worst actively destructive. And this could be read as the show mocking therapy, but I don't think that's what's happening. I think the show is making a more specific and more interesting point, that bad therapy is worse than no therapy at all. That well-meaning but incompetent intervention can actually do more harm than simply letting a kid work through their problems with the people who love them. Mr. Small's failure isn't a failure of the concept of therapy. It's a failure of application. He doesn't listen. He doesn't see the children in front of him. He projects his own framework onto their problems. And the result is that the kids, Gumball especially, develop a healthy skepticism of authority figures who claim to have the answers. And honestly, that skepticism is adaptive. In a world like Elmore, or let's be real, in the real world too, the ability to evaluate whether the person claiming to help you actually can help you is a crucial skill. Gumball doesn't trust Mr. Small not because Gumball is anti-therapy, but because Mr. Small hasn't earned that trust. And the show, by depicting bad counseling accurately, is actually making a pro-therapy argument. Kids deserve good help, not incense and platitudes. Real, attuned, evidence-based support. Which, when you think about it, is exactly what this show provides. The show itself is better therapy than anything Mr. Small offers. It validates emotions. It normalizes anxiety. It shows that families can be broken and loving at the same time. It depicts jealousy, depression, ego inflation, and identity confusion with accuracy and compassion. And it never, ever tells the viewer that these experiences make them broken. It says, you're a mess, and so am I, and so is everyone, and that's okay. That's the starting point, not the finish line. I keep coming back to this thought, and I think it's important enough to say plainly, The Amazing World of Gumball is the most psychologically literate children's show I've ever watched. Not because it uses clinical language or references therapy models, but because it understands, intuitively and consistently, how human beings actually work, how children actually feel, how families actually function. It gets the mess right. And getting the mess right is harder and more valuable than getting the theory right. You know, there's this idea in psychology called good enough parenting. It comes from Donald Winnicott, a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst. Winnicott argued that children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who are good enough. Parents who sometimes fail, who sometimes lose their temper, who sometimes get it wrong, but who are consistently present and fundamentally caring. Perfect parenting, Winnicott said, is actually harmful because it doesn't prepare children for a world that isn't perfect. Children need to experience manageable frustration. They need to learn that love survives conflict. They need to discover that relationships can bend without breaking. Nicole and Richard are good enough parents. Nicole's anger doesn't destroy the family. Richard's incompetence doesn't dissolve it. They fail, regularly and spectacularly, and the family survives every time. Not because the failures don't matter, but because the connection is stronger than the failures. And Gumball, anxious, insecure, ego-inflated Gumball, is slowly, unconsciously learning that lesson. He's learning that he can be a mess and still be loved, that he can fail and still belong, that the darkness comes and it goes, and his family is there on the other side. He might not remember the lesson next episode. That's okay. Winnicott would say, that's okay. The point isn't learning once. The point is having the experience available to learn from, again and again, as many times as it takes. Ben Bocquelet said in an interview that the characters were based on his own family. His mother is Nicole, his father is Richard, his sister is Anais, and Gumball is himself, or a version of himself. A caricature, exaggerated and blue and two-dimensional, living in a photographed world he doesn't quite belong in. And I think Bocquelet understood, maybe intuitively, maybe deliberately, that the truest way to depict a child's psychology isn't through careful clinical accuracy. It's through chaos, through a world where anything can happen, and usually does, where a kid can fight his own ego in a battle inside his memories, where jealousy is a literal possessing spirit, where growing up can be prevented by narrative structure, and where the darkness chases you through empty streets until you remember that you're loved. I want to end where we started. Gumball, standing in an empty Elmore, the darkness approaching. His legs won't move, and then they do. He runs. He makes it home. He opens his eyes, and his family is there. They were always there. It was all in his head, but it wasn't just in his head. That's the part the show doesn't say out loud, but knows. The darkness was real. The fear was real. The feeling of being alone in a world that's falling apart was real. And the solution, remembering that you're connected to people who love you, even imperfectly, even chaotically, was real too. So, if a psychologist were to write up a clinical summary of Gumball Watterson, a proper one, the kind you'd find in a case file, what would it say? It would say something like this. Patient is a 12-year-old male presenting with generalized anxiety, social anxiety, performance anxiety, and features of identity disturbance. He displays an inflated sense of self that appears compensatory for underlying low self-esteem. Defense mechanisms include humor, denial, projection, and self-handicapping. Attachment style is anxious preoccupied, likely developed in the context of an ambivalent relationship with his primary caregiver. He demonstrates significant capacity for empathy, particularly under crisis conditions, but struggles to sustain emotional attunement during routine interactions. Family system displays cross-generational transmission of anxiety patterns, parentification dynamics, and complementary dysfunction between parental figures. Patient's relationship with his peer group is characterized by high visibility and moderate social isolation. Despite significant challenges, the patient demonstrates strong protective factors, including at least one secure attachment relationship with an adoptive sibling, a stable, if chaotic, home environment, high creativity, and a persistent optimism that appears to function as a core resilience resource. Prognosis: guarded, but hopeful. The patient is 12. He has time. That's what the file would say. And then the psychologist would close the folder and think about what the file doesn't capture. The way this kid's eyes get when he looks at Penny. The way his voice cracks when he tells his dad he's his hero. The way he stands in an empty world, alone with his shadow, and finds the courage to run home. The file doesn't capture the way he makes Darwin laugh, or the way Nicole's expression softens when she watches him from the doorway. This tiny blue disaster of a son who is so much like her that it hurts. Or the way Richard, useless, wonderful Richard, looks at Gumball with an unconditional pride that has nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with existence. Richard is proud of Gumball for being alive, for being his son, for being here. And the file doesn't capture the way Gumball, when he thinks nobody's watching, sometimes does something so quietly kind that you'd miss it if you blinked. The way he sacrificed his own schemes to make sure Penny's cheerleading tryout went well in The Meddler. The way he stopped Leslie from being sabotaged in The Triangle, despite his own jealousy. The way he went back for Rob in the rerun, even though Rob was trying to destroy him. These moments, small, unglamorous, unrewarded, are the real Gumball. Not the ego, not the sarcasm, not the self-handicapping. The kid underneath all of it, who keeps reaching out even though his hands are shaking. That's what a psychologist would see, if they were any good. Not a diagnosis, not a case study, a kid. And here's one last thing I want to say, and then I'll let you go. I think the reason this show matters, the reason it's worth spending hours talking about, isn't because it's psychologically accurate, although it is. It isn't because it's funny, although it's one of the funniest shows ever made. It's because it does something that very few pieces of art do, in any medium, for any audience. It takes the experience of being a child seriously, not solemnly, not with the heavy-handed importance that some shows bring to very special episodes, but seriously, in the deepest sense. It says, your feelings are real. Your fears are real. The confusion you feel when you look at the world and it doesn't make sense, that's real. The way you love people too much and hurt people accidentally and want to be noticed and want to be left alone and feel like you're the most important person in the world and the least important person in the world, sometimes in the same minute, that's real. All of it. And you're not broken for feeling it. You're human. Or you're a blue cat. Either way, you're okay. And I think that's what a psychologist would say, ultimately, if they sat down with this show and really watched it. Not just the episodes that deal with obviously heavy themes. All of it. The silly ones. The weird ones. The ones where nothing happens except Gumball and Darwin trying to figure out what to do on a boring day. Because even those episodes, especially those episodes, are about the experience of being alive and young and confused and hopeful and afraid. Every episode of The Amazing World of Gumball is a therapy session that neither the character nor the viewer signed up for. And it works. It works because it doesn't try to fix anything. It just sits with you in the mess. And sometimes, in the sitting, something shifts. A psychologist wouldn't cure Gumball Watterson. There's nothing to cure. He's a child. He's growing. He's messy and broken and whole all at the same time. A psychologist would do what the show itself does. Sit with him, watch the patterns, notice the defenses, and underneath all of it, see the kid. Just a kid. A blue cat in a tan sweater, walking through a photographed world, trying to figure out who he is. 6 whiskers, only 5 visible at a time, because even his face is never quite fully shown. An oversized head full of anxiety and imagination and love that doesn't know where to go. Feet that don't wear shoes, because he was drawn by a man who based him on himself and didn't worry about shoes. That's Gumball. That's who a psychologist would see. And I really, honestly think that they'd like him. They'd worry about him a little. They'd admire his resilience and be concerned about his coping strategies and want to talk to his parents about the anger and the codependence and the intergenerational transmission of perfectionism and the importance of structure and the necessity of play. But mostly, they just sit with him and listen and let him talk about whatever he wants to talk about. Because that's what kids need more than diagnosis, more than intervention, more than any clinical framework or theoretical model. They need someone who shows up, someone who stays, someone who looks at the whole messy, chaotic, animated in 12 different styles mess of who they are and says, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. That's what the show does. That's what good therapy does. That's what love does. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope it gave you something to think about, or something to fall asleep to, or both. And I hope the next time you watch Gumball, you see a little bit more than you did before. Not because you need a psychology degree to enjoy this show, you absolutely don't, but because the layers are there. They were always there, and someone should talk about them. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. It means more than you know to have people who want to spend their time listening to someone talk about a cartoon for this long. If you want more of these, subscribe. Tell a friend. Leave a comment about your favorite Gumball episode, or about something you noticed that I missed. There's always more to find. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.